Hi, welcome to the presentation of an article discussion titled Selling Souls, the Effect of Globalization on Human Trafficking and Forced Servitude. And I'm Harini. First of all, let me explain globalization. It is the speed up of movements and exchanges of human beings, capital, goods, or technology. And what does globalization do? What changes does it bring? It eases the border restrictions, promote and increase interaction between regions and nations. And what are the implications? Globalization can become a threat when misused and taken advantage of. Example would be societal ills like inequality and poverty, or worse, first degree felonies like terrorism and human trafficking. It is very crucial to have a clear distinction between smuggling and human trafficking before we go on further. So the first distinction is who is injured by the act. If you look at smuggling, the individual agreed to be transported illegally into another nation for opportunities like job, and it is a crime against the state. Whereas with human trafficking, the individual lacked freedom to decide. Basically, they did not consent to be transported, and the act is done against their will. And it is a crime against the victim, and the individual is unaware of what awaits them in the destination country, like what would the working condition be like. Moving on, the second distinction would be nature of the crime and duration of the relationship between the facilitator and the individual. With smuggling, it is of commercial nature, which is a business transaction basically, and the relationship ends once the border is crossed and the settlement is done, payment, and the state is responsible and they have a right to deport the migrant if the migrant is caught. Whereas with human trafficking, the contract continues even after the border is crossed to maximize profit and other gains. All the nation state is responsible for victim protection and the prosecution of the traffickers. Moving on, the third distinction, the final distinction is whose responsibility is the victim. Under smuggling, as long as the victims are free from abuse while they are in the destination country, no protection of or assistance is required to be provided to these illegal immigrants who violate that nation's law. Whereas for under human trafficking cases, all countries involved, from origin till destination, they are accountable for the harm suffered by the victim, and these nations they are required to give security and assistance to the victims, and the nation where the trafficking occurs is responsible to prosecute the traffickers. Moving on, what are the challenges with offering protection to victims of human trafficking and smuggling? So the first one is denial of victims' freedom. They are stuck in the predicament and can escape only with the risk. What happens to them is in the hands of the trafficker or the end user, basically their fate. And the second challenge would be slavery and its exploitation, where the victims are taken advantage of or made use of for personal and professional gains. Both these challenges, they are violations of human rights and is a criminal offense in many countries. Moving on, what are the consequences of confusing human trafficking with smuggling? The victims of human trafficking may thought to be illegal immigrants and so denied them any sort of assistance or protection. The victims may be deported or worse, charged in court and subject to penalties. So, when victims are mistaken as illegal immigrants, automatically, like the traffickers, are freed because the assumption is that the act happened with consent. Now, let's look at how global supply and demand fuels human trafficking. Firstly, demand for cheap labor to achieve higher profit. So, open trade and global market have created a huge demand for cheap and free labor to cut down labor costs. This is achieved by exploiting needy workers from less developed countries that has no um, that have no strict labor laws or policies. These laborers are forced to work painful hours like excessive hours, and they sometimes get abused by their employers if they protest. Around 3 million people, including children, are working in highly hazardous conditions involving chemicals, pesticides, and dangerous mines too, like the Mica mine. And in 2003, the world's most popular agriculture product, as you all know, cocoa, its prices were held down in world market by practicing child slavery. In woven rug industry, 300,000 children from India and Pakistan were exploited in exchange for one meal a day, and placed to sleep as a strategy to lower production costs. And by far the largest trafficked persons are young women and girls from South Asia to Bangkok, Thailand to feed sex tourism. Moving on, human traffickers exploit basic human desire for a better life, especially during vulnerable times like collapse of home country. Nigerian girls were trafficked for sexual exploitation and were controlled by voodoo, belief of voodoo, and fear that disclosure would mean death of family and themselves. The victims were made to believe to lift the curse, they have to compensate the traffickers. And there are also cases where young and naive girls were promised opportunities abroad as models, placed in prestigious university, or opportunity to play like professional sports, only to be deceived later. And women seeking marital bliss or better means for their family were taken advantage of by forcing them into servitude under that bondage agreement. Next, we are going to look at supply and transportation structure. The main goal of traffickers is to make money by satisfying demand for illegal labor and sexual servitude. Sadly, more than 64% of traffickers are trusted acquaintances or family friends, as reported. Traffickers usually can be small-time operators or done as a side job in a service industry like travel agencies. They can be diplomats. Example, an officer from Swiss embassy in Pakistan, he was um, charged with human trafficking of Pakistani women. Or can be white-collar professionals or criminal syndicates who use trafficked children to sell drugs, become beggars, or commit street crime for the organization. There are basically three phases to carry out the trafficking. The first phase is mobilization phase, that is to choose the victims. It can be via direct contact or media advertisement. The second phase would be en route phase to take care of travel documents and smooth journey basically between nations. And the third phase, final phase, is the arrival and dispersal, which is the distribution of victims according to arrangements and also in the end payment settlement. And lastly, high consumer demand, which explains why basically human trafficking takes place. It hiked to cater growing demand for domestic services, especially with increasing dual career household, which means both husband and wife are working and they need help at home. And also demand for cheap foreign labor hiked to cover the place local labor has left to climb up the corporate ladder. So basically, those who are working as laborers now they've become professionals. So we need foreign labor to sort of cover their place. And more consumer drove the expansion of sex trade and sex tourism worldwide, and also international competition to produce cheaper goods, which can be achieved by cheap labor. Moving on, what are the impact of globalization on human trafficking? It has brought inequality within and among nations, um, and it also accelerated dismantling of borders and caused danger to its people by putting them in unknown situation. People rush to globalization has made them goal driven and materialistic, and they forget how to be human, basically. And nations, on the other hand, are struggling to cope with new problems while working on old ones. The commoditization of human beings. So basically, human trafficking is basically um, a business. Um, Too much importance has been placed on economic gains and expansion until the vulnerable and at risk communities are neglected. Human beings are traded on the basis of contractual negotiations, and human beings are considered as super community because of low investment, longevity, easy handling and transportation across nations, and multiple usage, sadly, very sadly. And to conclude, political leaders should reassess globalization and enhance detection and end the human trafficking. Nations need to sit together and bring solution because failing to provide the most basic human right is just unacceptable. Um, Combating human trafficking requires to monitor labor practices and demolish damaging ones. Fundamental adjustment in social condition is also very much needed, where you see parents who are the very person supposed to be protecting their children, when they themselves willingly trade the children for financial gains, that is just a fundamental error in the social condition, and it needs to be improved. With that, we've come to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for listening.